substantial economic engagement to Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela?
Haven't changed to that.
How is it related to the topic?
Well, because the fact is that it involves switching from American corn-based ethanol to Cuban sugarcane-based ethanol.
Okay. How are you going to get Cuban cane sugar for the Cuban cane sugar ethanol
By trading.
with the embargo on Cuba?
Well, we'd have to remove that or significantly lower it.
Okay. Define isotopic, please.
Isotopic. It has to do something with the atmosphere, one of the levels of the atmosphere, that's where most of the gases that I spoke of go.
Okay. Thank you. Define aquifers.
Aquifers are underground, I guess you can say underground tunnels where water flows freely under the soil.
Okay. How does global warming relate to this topic of economic engagement between these nations?
Because corn-based ethanol releases a lot of fertilizer and pesticides, which also go up into the atmosphere as we speak, which also contributes largely to global warming. It actually raises the temperature.
Okay. What evidence do you have, and what are the sources of this evidence?
Regarding the what?
Regarding all of it.
All of it. So you'd like to see my file, I'm assuming?
Yes, please. A copy would be nice.
Well, this is the only copy we got, so you can have it. You can check it out.
All right. Thank you. 6 closed. Prep time, please. Substantial economic engagement to Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela?
Haven't changed to that.
How is it related to the topic?
Well, because the fact is that it involves switching from American corn-based ethanol to Cuban sugarcane-based ethanol.
Okay. How are you going to get Cuban cane sugar for the Cuban cane sugar ethanol
By trading.
with the embargo on Cuba?
Well, we'd have to remove that or significantly lower it.
Okay. Define isotopic, please.
Isotopic. It has to do something with the atmosphere, one of the levels of the atmosphere, that's where most of the gases that I spoke of go.
Okay. Thank you. Define aquifers.
Aquifers are underground, I guess you can say underground tunnels where water flows freely under the soil.
Okay. How does global warming relate to this topic of economic engagement between these nations?
Because corn-based ethanol releases a lot of fertilizer and pesticides, which also go up into the atmosphere as we speak, which also contributes largely to global warming. It actually raises the temperature.
Okay. What evidence do you have, and what are the sources of this evidence?
Regarding the what?
Regarding all of it.
All of it. So you'd like to see my file, I'm assuming?
Yes, please. A copy would be nice.
Well, this is the only copy we got, so you can have it. You can check it out.
All right. Thank you. 6 closed. Prep time, please. Do you want a roadmap? I will be running a counter argument against. It'll be about how Cuba is a threat to national society, to U.S. national security, and it will be about the Cuban embargo and the civil rights atrocities that Cuba has committed. Partner ready? Opponent ready?
Yeah.
Judge ready? I'll begin. Cuba represents a threat to U.S. national security. Point 1. Cuba remains a threat to the U.S. national security. Subpoint A. Cuba remains on the official U.S. list as a state sponsor of terrorism. Schmidt, in 2012, states that Cuba retains its designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, and we in the United States need to recognize that. We need to understand that they're working in connection with Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, all to subvert the democracy here in the Americas. We in the United States must understand that anything we do that helps the Cuban regime monetarily will only hurt the Cuban citizens. Cuba continues to support terrorist groups in Colombia. Johnson stated in 2012, Castro's aid to Colombia's two main guerrilla groups, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and the National Liberation Army, prolonged a brutal 40-year civil war. Cuba's Communist Party is a leading member of the Foro de Sao Paulo, a platform for dozens of Latin American leftist parties, and 3 terrorist groups, the FARC, the ELN, and Peru's Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, all of which have opposed U.S. policies favoring free trade, property rights, and the rule of law. Obviously, a more democratic and market-oriented Cuba is in the geopolitical, economic, and security interests of the United States. Subpoint C, Cuba supports terrorist groups in the Middle East. Mika stated in 2012, Cuba, as the chairman of the International Relations Committee, has mentioned in a U.S.-designed Senate sponsor of terrorism, which is directly responsible for acts of international terrorism, harbors fugitives from the U.S. law, actively partners with other terrorist states, such as Iran and Syria, and terrorist groups such as Hezbollah and FARC, just to name a few. Mihan stated in 2011, it is important to remember that before September 11th, Hezbollah, not Al-Qaeda, was responsible for more American deaths than any other terrorist organization. This is an organization that Cuba itself supports and is helping keep them running. Subpoint E, Cuba engages in espionage activities on behalf of terrorist groups. Simmons stated in 2012, terrorist groups are evolving animals, much like other entities. Cuba has historically been tied to well over 40 different terrorist groups since the 1960s, and our basic protocol is to provide them with intelligence training first, let them get on their feet so they can begin conducting their own operations, and then, once they're successful, migrate over to bilateral operations within their own lane of the road, if you will. So in essence, it allows Cuba to conduct intelligence operations by proxy. My opponent is stating that we should trade with Cuba to get the sugarcane ethanol that he is speaking of. It is unsafe to U.S. national security, and also a big part of why we simply can't do that is the embargo that has been going on for around 50 years now, which I will discuss now. The embargo still continues to serve a meaningful purpose. We still need it today. Point 1, the embargo makes a moral statement about Cuba's denial of human rights. Subpoint A, the key purpose of the embargo is to make a moral statement. Ross Lenton in 2012 stated, in addition to imposing economic pressure on the Castro regime and holding it accountable for actions against U.S. interests, the embargo is a moral stance against the brutal dictatorship. Over the last 50 years, the embargo has served as a constant form of solidarity with the Cuban people. The embargo will remain in place until free, fair, and transparent elections are scheduled, political prisoners are released, and freedom of expression and the press are established. We simply cannot remove this embargo and begin trading with Cuba. It will make us look weak. It will make us look as if we do not stand in solidarity with the Cuban people who have all these human rights committed upon them, and it will make us look like we do not stand for the morals that we as American people hold to our own. Subpoint B, the Cuban government continues to deny human rights. They flat out deny the rights of their people. In 2012, Hernandez stated in 2012, the Castro brothers do not have limits in their cruelty. Their murderous nature led them to execute thousands of people at the beginning of the revolution. Today, they kill in a more subtle form. We must not forget the death, in very strange circumstances, the leader of the Ladies in White, Laura Toledo, in October 2011. Also, we cannot forget the deaths of hunger strike victims of political prisoners, Orlando Zapata Tumayo in February 2010, who was denied water for 18 days, and Wilman Villar Mendoza in January 2012, who was tortured by being placed in a boarded-up, dark, damp, and putrid cell. Extermination against those who dissent and or oppose the Castros is the policy of the state, meaning the Castro brothers and the regime has passed laws and different things that make it completely legal for them to kill people who oppose them. These are not people we should be trading with, even if it will help the environment. There are better means that we can do that with than trading with these brutal, evil dictators. Cuba is a communist country, meaning that all of the power lies in the hands of Fidel Castro. It did lie in the hands of Fidel Castro. Now it lies in the hands of Raul Castro, his brother. He makes sure that the power remains in the hands of his family so that he can do whatever he wants with the country. And Smith stated in 2012, more than 50 years after Castro's assumption of power in Cuba, the U.S. Department of State's Human Rights Report on Cuba describes it as a government that still denies its citizens the right to change their government, that threatens, harasses, and beats its opponents through state security forces and government-organized mobs, that sentences opponents to harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, that arbitrarily detains human rights advocates and members of independent organizations, and that selectively prosecutes perceived opponents and then denies them a fair trial. This nation is completely unfree. It is evil, it is wicked, and it is the opposite of everything that America stands for and we believe in. We cannot trade with them. We can't. The embargo is held for a reason. It'll be held for a reason until things are fixed with the relations between Cuba. And just to help the environment a bit, there are much better ways for us to do that than to trade with people who kill their own people and won't let their people vote in a fair trial and won't let their people be free. That's all. That's my case. Open to CX.
How is Cuba a threat to national security?
Cuba is a threat to national security because they are a nation that in the past has allied themselves with nations that are very opposed to us, such as in the Cold War they allied with the Soviet Union and let them build nuclear bases in Cuba. That way the Soviet Union, if they wanted to, could attack us with nuclear weapons.
You mentioned Colombia, like how they trade with Colombia. How is that relevant to the topic?
It's relevant to the topic because Colombia is a very terrorist nation. They have a lot of terrible things going on there. It shows how Cuba is not good for us to trade with.
Okay. Does the government support these terrorist groups?
Yes, very much so. Great bit. Yes, it states right here, Cuba, as the chairman of the International Relations Committee, has mentioned in a U.S. designated state sponsor of terrorism, which is directly responsible for acts of international terrorism, harbors fugitives from U.S. law, and actively partners with other terrorist states. This is the Castro regime that is doing all this. They allow this to happen.
Is that?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Is that it?
No, you got 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Can you define by proxy? I think that's what you said.
By proxy? By proxy is a means of passing by different proxies, and proxies are rules and regulations that are set up. So by proxy is passing through that.
Okay. How would this affect our solidarity?
Okay, so I stated earlier in this that the embargo that we have in place is it's to show solidarity with the Cuban people and that we understand that they are going through a lot of hardships. It shows that we are not willing to tolerate what the Castro brothers are doing. And if we cancel that, it makes it look as if we don't support what they've gone through at all.
You said that there are better ways of trading with them or having economic engagement with them. Can you name any of those that you might think would help?
I don't recall. I stated that there were better ways to change the environmental aspects of it.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. I'm done with CX.
Thank you.